Disc 4. One of the changes Mrs. Thatcher had to become used to was coping with the fact that the number 10 switchboard was no longer at her beck and call. This small team of highly efficient and friendly operators work hard to make sure that all the senior staff are never out of contact for long. As a political journalist, I was on their list. The calm announcement, "Hello, John, it's number 10 here," might reach me at any time of the day or night, and it was hard not to feel a twinge of excitement, even if it was simply a message giving the time of the next briefing by the Prime Minister's press secretary. For Mrs. Thatcher it was a serious blow to be deprived of their services. She was embarrassed to admit to one of her staff that she did not know how to reach her daughter. In the past, it had been so easy to say, "Could you get Carol for me?" When the phone did ring in her borrowed flat, there were times when Mrs. Thatcher was unable to throw off the instinctive responses which had conditioned her life at number 10. In her first television interview, recorded in the United States, she told Barbara Walters, "The telephone goes, and immediately you think, 'Oh, goodness me, the United Nations is sitting.' Then you realise that it's no longer you anymore. I remember when the tanks had gone into Vilnius. I kind of leapt up and dialed the telephone. Then I realised it was no longer me." It is a significant phrase, "no longer me," as if she had left this life, or she was playing a childhood game where she was no longer it. 3 months after Mrs. Thatcher left office, she admitted, "Even now, driving down Whitehall towards Westminster, all of a sudden my mind still thinks we'll turn into Downing Street, and then I realise we're not going to." Her failure to adjust was also apparent in the way she treated some of her former colleagues. The Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, would be surprised to find that she was on the phone behaving as if she was still the Prime Minister. He told me, "She used to ring up and sort of give me instructions, really, and I didn't care for that." I asked him, did he have to take the calls from her? "Oh, yes, of course," he replied. "I didn't run away from her, and I'd learnt how to argue with her. That's something you learn when you're one of her ministers." What is significant is that he should be talking about arguments he had with Mrs. Thatcher after she had ceased to have any direct power over his actions. Mrs. Thatcher's first major task was dealing with the 20,000 letters which had flooded in since her resignation. They arrived in huge sacks from the post office. Mr. Whittingdale was one of the small staff who had to try to sort out the ones that really mattered. He said, "In among them would be a letter from the Sultan of Brunei, or George Shultz, the former US Secretary of State, and you had to find them, and it wasn't a matter of getting a few temps in. They wouldn't know who George Shultz was." Mrs. Thatcher was not always sensible in the way she tried to answer the letters. Mr. Whittingdale remembers her coming into the office, plucking a couple of letters from the top of a pile and settling down to write 2-page replies. These letters, he said, were from ordinary members of the public saying, "We think it's so sad, we like you so much," and she gave these lengthy responses. There was also a steady stream of visitors, many of them full of ideas about how she should spend her time. Memoirs would certainly be written. A deal was eventually completed with HarperCollins for 2 volumes. It was worth an astonishing total of £3.5 million. With her speeches in the United States, which could bring her $50,000 a time, as well as the large sum she was paid as a consultant to the tobacco giant Philip Morris, Mrs. Thatcher soon became extremely wealthy. She set up an organisation called the Thatcher Foundation to promote her political views. The idea was to encourage donations on the American pattern and to reinforce the impression that, although she was out of office, her influence across the world was still a force to be reckoned with. From the moment she announced her resignation, Mrs. Thatcher was determined that her voice would not be stilled. Soon after the Gulf War ended, Mrs. Thatcher made a triumphant trip to the United States. For those watching closely to see if she would be at all critical of Mr. Major, there were some ominous signs. In one of her interviews, Mrs. Thatcher claimed to see a tendency to try to undermine what I achieved and to go back to giving more powers to government. Her American trip ended on a high note in California's Orange County. Dressed in royal purple, she waved to the crowds who thronged the shopping mall of Costa Mesa. "We thank you so much," she intoned regally, and no one seemed to think it was inappropriate when the band played God Save the Queen. Her supporters in Britain were keen to keep the flame burning. Her old friend Cecil Parkinson agreed to chair a new right-of-centre group of Tory MPs called Conservative Way Forward, with Mrs. Thatcher as their president. The aim was to keep alive her vision, and this was coupled with an injunction to give positive support to John Major in carrying this vision into the future. Summing up the mood on the right of the Conservative Party, The Economist concluded, "After Mr. Major's honeymoon, those right-wingers who gave away the Conservative Party to meek, neat John are wondering whether the chap is after all a cad. Margaret Thatcher, self-proclaimed mother of the bride, has been fingering her steel-reinforced handbag." Mrs. Thatcher made clear that moves towards a federal Europe would be increasingly opposed by her in public. She even suggested that the commitment on the continent to democracy was in doubt. Our parliamentary tradition was so much longer. "We are 700 years old," she said. "Germany's parliament is only 40, Spain a dozen years old, Portugal even less." She reminded her viewers of Britain's victorious role in the Second World War. "We were the people who stood alone when the whole of the rest of Europe collapsed." Her comments came at a delicate time for Mr. Major. 2 days later, he was due to make his first important foreign policy speech in Bonn. I was sent to cover the event. After the frostiness of the relationship between Mrs. Thatcher and Helmut Kohl, the warmth was undeniable. In his speech to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Mr. Major made clear his determination to change British policy on Europe. He said, "My aims for Britain in the community can be simply stated. I want us to be where we belong, at the very heart of Europe, working with our partners in building the future." In Downing Street briefings, it was confirmed that Mr. Major intended his speech to repudiate Mrs. Thatcher's comments at Bruges. As the right wing of the party expressed their dismay, Edward Heath made a point of praising the refreshing breeze of the new policies. And to drive the point home, he added, "At last we are beginning to shed the albatrosses that have weighed us down over the last few years." In just a few short weeks, the scale of the differences between the old and the new regimes had been opened to the public. One of Mrs. Thatcher's aides said part of the problem had been caused by the way she had answered questions in the United States. She had not realized the extent to which they would be reported back home. But in all her 11 years as Prime Minister, I never found her lacking in that kind of awareness. She was always extremely careful about which questions she chose to reply to. Of much more relevance was Mrs. Thatcher's frustration at being out of power and her determination to see that her views were still taken into account. At a rational level, she knew that in the run-up to the next election she had to support Mr. Major. She had suffered particularly from the bitter criticisms made of her leadership by Mr. Heath. It would not have amused her to be told that Tory MPs were now calling her Ted in skirts, or more alliteratively, and only in private, Ted with tits. John Major prides himself on the way he can read other people's body language. Partly it is because, to a degree many politicians do not share, he has a genuine interest in how other people are thinking. When he was in office, it was sometimes a blessing, but in many ways it was a curse. He was one of the most sensitive Prime Ministers ever to inhabit Number 10. As a broadcast journalist, I frequently felt that he was worrying about what I and my colleagues were privately thinking, and often the mundane truth was that we were thinking of more trivial matters than Mr. Major's premiership. Mr. Major's sensitive nature was particularly challenged in his dealings with Mrs. Thatcher. He reacted badly to the way she accepted with alacrity the chairmanship of the Bruges Group and the No Turning Back Group, both dedicated to preventing any further moves towards European integration. He was particularly upset that the way he had established friendly relations with Helmut Kohl should be looked upon as a sign of backsliding over the European issue. Some conflict between Mr. Major and Mrs. Thatcher was inevitable. For most people, when a new appointment is made to a job they have cherished, it can be hard to summon up warm feelings towards their successor. But as I saw Mrs. Thatcher scurrying to take her place on the back benches on one of the few occasions she went to the Commons, it was easy to imagine her sense of humiliation. She was no longer the confident figure of old. She looked like the victim of a robbery, anxious to return to what she would regard as normal life. Her change in position seriously affected her relationship with Mr. Major. All the time that he had been a minister in her government, he had been able to exercise his considerable charm on Mrs. Thatcher. But now it was essential for him to carve out a quite separate role. He was hoping to forge a more compassionate image of Conservative leadership. He wanted to see a nation at ease with itself. It fitted in with his personality. He believed it chimed more with the public mood, and he was certain it would improve his chances of winning the next election. But Mr. Major's desire to conciliate was often taken to be a sign of indecision or even weakness. The truth is that on many of the complicated options facing government, Mr. Major did not have a view. He did not even have a prejudice. The contrast with Mrs. Thatcher could hardly have been more striking. Mrs. Thatcher's determination to initiate an argument and then master a brief before it was exposed to the public was one of her great strengths. It enabled her to dominate the government and could leave the opposition in the Commons floundering. But when she was successful, it was often because she allowed herself to be argued out of her initial approach. There were many occasions when she was forced to change her mind. The lady was for turning. The pro-European cabinet minister John Gummer enjoyed having arguments with her. They sometimes disagreed strongly, but she was prepared to listen once she knew you were loyal. Mr. Gummer gave an illuminating example of what it was like when Mrs. Thatcher grappled with practical problems. The issue was hardly exciting. It was over how Europe should regulate the movement of dead meat. As Agriculture Minister, Mr. Gummer had to negotiate the rules covering the movement of animal carcasses. He was about to go into a final round in Brussels when he realised to his dismay that the advice he had been given by the British experts was simply wrong. Only 3 weeks before, Mrs. Thatcher had made a speech in which she highlighted this issue as a classic example of Britain being right and the rest of Europe wrong. There was only one course Mr. Gummer thought might work. He had a set of storyboards made up, like the large cards used in Hollywood to explain how the story of a film will develop. On these cards, he put down the key facts to explain why the British view was mistaken. He hoped Mrs. Thatcher would be so taken by the novelty of his approach that she would be prepared to listen. Mr. Gummer told me, if you could get her to listen to the case, she was remarkably good at accepting the facts and agreeing, better than any leader I have come across. This is how the minister put his case. Now, Prime Minister, it's a rather complex issue, and you'll be interested in it because it's a scientific issue, but it does involve me actually explaining the details one by one. Do you mind if I do it like this? He put up his storyboards and for 5 minutes held the rapt attention of the Prime Minister. At the end, she said, to his immense relief, "Well, John, I think you're right. I'm sorry you're right. I wish you weren't." Mr. Gummer went off to Brussels and, with as much dignity as he could muster, signalled a U-turn by the supposedly hard-line Thatcher government. Fortunately for them, political journalists like me were less interested in the movement of animal carcasses than perhaps we should have been. What makes this story important is the way it demonstrates how Mrs. Thatcher could respond in government to day-to-day problems. It highlights her attention to detail. Above all, the story shows that over the vital question of Europe, she was able to be far more flexible in government than she ever seemed to manage once she had left office. In part, this was due to a sharp reduction of quality in the advice she received. No longer did she have passionate, intelligent ministers ready to argue with her at any time of the day or night. More and more she was dependent on the advice of friends and allies. In retirement, she was free to make up her own mind and much more likely to make mistakes. It might have been very different if, like some of her predecessors, she had been able to retire to a country estate. But even if she had one, she would have found life in the country too boring. Apart from her relationship with Dennis, her family life was not particularly close. Her son Mark lived abroad, and her daughter Carol did not appear to be a frequent visitor. One of her closest friends and colleagues, Lord Pole, said that ever since she left Downing Street, she never had a happy day. She lived for her work, and she lived particularly for the work of politics. Home, she once confessed, is what you come to when you haven't anything better to do. Her faithful press secretary, Sir Bernard Ingham, would continue to visit her regularly at her office in Belgravia. He told me, she had no interest outside politics, none whatsoever. In office she devoted 20 of the 24 hours to it every day, and coming off it was like somebody coming off heroin. The routine they established in office was repeated, though far less frequently in her new life. He said, she sits down, welcomes me warmly, offers me a coffee, and we are immediately down to business. No small talk, no anecdotes, no gossip. It was clearly a routine both of them enjoyed. It's quite entertaining and very funny at times, Sir Bernard told me. I am very fond of her because she is her own person and she will never change. But to Mr. Major and his close colleagues, there was nothing innocent about Mrs. Thatcher's reluctance to leave the political world. It posed a danger to them, which increasingly they felt they could not ignore. In his memoirs, Mr. Major wrote, lesser men than those who had once advised her now poured poison into her ear, perhaps with the intention of cheering her up. The target was, inevitably, who else could it be, her successor. In October 1991, Mr. Major's first party conference as leader was a nervous occasion. The big question for the organisers was, what would they do about Mrs. Thatcher? Her relationship with the adoring rank and file was a source of real strength when she was Prime Minister. It was a strange mixture of the last night of the proms and a Billy Graham rally. There was no question of Mrs. Thatcher simply deciding not to attend the conference. But the organisers asked her not to make a speech. A party official confessed to a journalist, if she had been allowed to speak, it would have been difficult to stop her if she headed off in the wrong direction. She was escorted onto the platform by Mr. Major and the party chairman, Chris Patten, and was given a standing ovation which lasted for about 5 minutes. There were calls for her to speak, but the woman whose recorded public comments run to more than 14 million words kept the agreement and said nothing. It was not surprising that Mrs. Thatcher did not stay on in Blackpool to hear Michael Heseltine's speech the next day. It was a triumph. I met him later at a Geoffrey Archer party at the Imperial Hotel. I had known Geoffrey since he offered to act as my agent after seeing me perform a stand-up comedy routine when I was a student at Oxford. On that occasion I declined, but since he had become deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, I had been keen to be invited to his parties. They always attracted the powerful, and for journalists were a happy hunting ground for news and gossip. Mr. Heseltine disapproved of Geoffrey Archer, and he would not normally attend any Archer party. On this occasion he stopped briefly, only because it was on the way to his own room in the hotel. Unlike almost all other senior Tories, Mr. Heseltine simply did not trust him. Mr. Heseltine's coolness did not deter Geoffrey, who was simply delighted that he had shown up. The Archers were hoping to demonstrate that, after the traumatic change of leadership, they were still a force to be reckoned with. I congratulated Mr. Heseltine on his conference speech. He questioned whether a BBC correspondent should be making such a judgment, but I quickly assured him that I was not taking sides, merely reporting a straightforward fact. He had been given a standing ovation of more than 2 minutes' duration. Mr. Heseltine was once again firmly installed as the conference darling. That night, on the third-floor landing of the Imperial Hotel, he told me, "You know, a small group of protesters could have ruined my speech. All they had to do was to unfurl a banner from the balcony saying, 'Traitor,' and I would not have been able to continue." In his first, not particularly impressive conference speech as Prime Minister, Mr. Major tried to bring the two former Prime Ministers together, if only as an example of the party's success. They symbolised, he said, the Conservative commitment to providing opportunity for all. the builder's son from Broadstairs, as he put it, as well as the grocer's daughter from Grantham. As the Prime Minister left Blackpool, the assessment of the party officials was that it was not such a bad conference as it might have been. But John Major would soon have to face what would be the most politically difficult and dangerous negotiations of his career. It was just his luck that the future of the European Union would now dominate the agenda, an issue guaranteed to increase the tension between him and Mrs. Thatcher. When a party becomes obsessed by an issue, they keep picking away at it like a scab. The politician and writer Roy Jenkins used that striking phrase to explain why the Labour Party could not resist arguing about nuclear disarmament during the 1980s. It could be applied equally to the interminable debate about Europe which captivated the Conservatives throughout the 1990s. These internal debates take on a life of their own. They seem to flourish whenever a small group of party members assemble, and whatever the original issue, before long the party appears to lose touch with the public at large. As happens when a family engages in heated argument, outsiders tend to make their excuses and leave. Any attempt to understand Mrs. Thatcher's determination to pursue the European issue once she had left Downing Street has to acknowledge the obsessive nature of the debate at that time within the Conservative Party. But that does not explain why someone with her breadth of interest in politics should have been prepared to narrow her interest in this way. I think that stemmed from the manner of her dismissal as Prime Minister. If Mrs. Thatcher had been put on trial, and she felt that what had happened was not dissimilar, one of the main charges would have been that she had dealt inappropriately with the other European leaders. This had triggered Sir Geoffrey Howe's resignation, which prompted Mr. Heseltine to mount his challenge. The main issue separating him and Mrs. Thatcher was Europe. This clearly affected the votes cast in the first ballot and also the attitude of the Cabinet. Mrs. Thatcher considered the way she had been treated was deeply unfair, and on this particular issue she had a chance of proving to everyone that they were wrong and she was right. I believe Mrs. Thatcher used the European issue to get her own back. Close friends and allies are dismissive of this explanation. You have, Lord Pole told me, a politician of such deep conviction that whatever cause she espoused, she was convinced of its rightness. She didn't have the traditional British weakness of seeing both sides of the question. There was one right view, and it was hers. Lord Pole was also prepared to argue that her vision of Europe's future would be well judged by history. He told me, "I think Margaret Thatcher foresaw better than anyone else in the Tory party the challenge which Europe would increasingly present to us." Another of Mrs. Thatcher's allies, Lord Tebbit, insists that Mrs. Thatcher picked on Europe because she felt strongly that British interests were seriously threatened. For much of 1991, Mr. Major had to take into account the looming problem of the critical European negotiations due to end at Maastricht in December. Most of the other member states were keen to let the European institutions prepare for a single currency. They were also looking for a closer, more coherent structure in the way the institutions were organised. On November the 20th, Mr. Major opened the debate on a government motion which spoke of Britain's interest in being at the heart of Europe. He was careful to signal where Britain would refuse to compromise: foreign policy, immigration and asylum matters, crime and terrorism would all be dealt with by the governments working together, with each country able to exercise a veto. But Mr. Major was prepared to accept that on the most important issue of all, the plan for a single currency, Britain would not oppose using the European institutions to help organise what became known as the euro. When Mrs. Thatcher rose to intervene in the debate, the government thought they knew the line she would take. She had seen the Foreign Secretary that morning. Douglas Hurd candidly admits that he called at her office. There was no question, it seems, of the former Prime Minister taking it upon herself to go round and see him. In his diary, Mr. Hurd wrote, "Faintly chaotic, but a good atmosphere. She will vote for the government tomorrow, but mobilise huge forces against us after Maastricht if we sin." Mr. Hurd's use of the word sin is significant. There was an almost religious fervour in the way the Eurosceptics tackled this issue. To start with, Mrs. Thatcher appeared keen not to make her opposition too obvious. Having approved of Mr. Major's pledge to remove unwanted proposals from the draft treaty, she said, "In my day, that would have required the occasional use of the handbag. Now it will doubtless be the cricket bat, but that is a good thing because it will be harder." But her best joke was later in the speech, and that was unintentional. Referring to Mr. Hurd, she said, "I was very grateful to my Foreign Secretary." When this was greeted with a gale of laughter and cries of "Her Foreign Secretary," she failed to see the point. "My right honourable friend is used to both praise and blame from me," she responded, and then, slightly flustered, she went on, "Agreed, excellent, good." MPs on both sides of the Commons treated her warmly. It was like the return of a well-loved actor. Mrs. Thatcher went on to make clear her opposition to Mr. Major's decision to allow the European institutions to take part in the management of the single currency. She argued that any such proposal should be subject to a referendum. Her comment caught Mr. Major by surprise. There was no chance now of trying to disguise their disagreement on this issue. In the same debate, before Mrs. Thatcher had spoken, Mr. Major said, "I do not favour the idea of a referendum. I do not favour referendums in a parliamentary democracy." In the past, this had been the view of Mrs. Thatcher, who used to argue that referendums were a device favoured by dictators. What annoyed Mr. Major was that after the Maastricht debate, Mrs. Thatcher turned on him personally for ruling out a referendum. In a television interview with ITN, she complained that he had not answered her case for the voice of the people to be heard. It was a remarkably uninhibited interview, which once again underlined Mrs. Thatcher's determination not to be silenced in the interests of party unity. "I still have a role," she said, "and I hope that the things I have said will influence the Prime Minister at Maastricht." A total of 6 Conservative MPs were so concerned about the approach being taken by Mr. Major, they went into the no lobbies at the end of the debate, and 9 others abstained. It was not the wholehearted endorsement Mr. Major might have hoped for as he prepared for his most serious political challenge since taking office. My overriding memory was of how cold it was in Maastricht. We had only limited access to the leading figures in the conference centre, and it was hardly exciting. The drama would take place in the private talks. The Minister for Europe was the former government whip Tristan Garel-Jones, who gave the impression he was privy to plenty of secrets, but he could seldom be relied upon to reveal them to reporters. He kept quiet about one of the most interesting moments of the 2-day summit, which was when the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, went missing. It is easy to depict this as a simple misunderstanding, but it still rankles with Mr. Major. An anxious Mr. Garel-Jones told him how officials were in despair because Mr. Lamont had walked out of a meeting of finance ministers. They had been discussing what for Britain was the most important part of the negotiations, the clause which would allow the UK to opt out of the single currency. "The rest of them are discussing our opt-out," Mr. Garel-Jones told the Prime Minister. "Our opt-out, and we're not there." Mr. Major agreed that Mr. Lamont should be found, and some calm was restored when the Chancellor arrived to join a meeting. Mr. Lamont bitterly rejects the accusation that his behaviour threatened a successful negotiation of the opt-out clause. He had no intention of even discussing it. Before the summit began, the British side had drawn up a protocol in legally watertight language. It was not up for negotiation, Mr. Lamont argued. When the other finance ministers began to discuss the document, Mr. Lamont walked out, leaving one of his officials to observe what happened. Mr. Lamont admits to being angry. "I tried hard to slam the door," he writes, "but it was a heavy, thick door that only moved very slowly in a gradual, creaky way. I learnt later that the officials said I'd gone to the loo. Mr. Lamont insists that this strategy worked. When he did return to the negotiating table, the protocol had been accepted without amendment. He said if I'd stayed there, I'm sure I would have been bogged down in line-by-line discussion, and that would have been risky. Mr. Major is not impressed by this account. It was an extraordinary way for Norman to behave. He could simply have asked for a recess. Instead, he just upped and went. According to Mr. Major, the matter was only resolved when he agreed with other heads of government that if they left the opt-out untouched, he would help them on other matters. This still left the most difficult of the topics: how to accommodate Mr. Major's insistence that Britain would not be covered by the social chapter, which dealt with issues involving union rights. At about 1:30 a.m., a deal was finally struck. Another opt-out was agreed. Mr. Major had maintained his vital red lines. He'd also managed to keep his Eurosceptic Employment Secretary, Michael Howard, on board. All that was left for the Prime Minister to do was not to appear triumphant. It only took a casual word from one of the Press Secretary's staff to prevent that happening. A comment passed on by Chris Moncrief, the ever-diligent editor of the Press Association, blew the strategy apart. He wrote a piece in the early hours which said, Prime Minister John Major stamped his signature on an historic deal for closer European Union early today and declared it is game, set and match for Britain. The phrase would haunt Mr. Major for the rest of his time at Number 10, even though he never made that comment in public. Not only did it annoy the leaders of the other member states, Mr. Major's opponents also were able to argue that, by sounding so triumphant, he had shown how little he understood the significance of the treaty. When Mr. Major returned to the Commons to report on the outcome, he won the enthusiastic support of most Conservative MPs. When it came to the vote at the end of a 2-day debate on the Maastricht deal, Mrs. Thatcher abstained. Only 7 Tories voted against. Norman Tebbit was passionately critical of the deal. For Mr. Lamont, the success of the negotiations were bittersweet. Sitting next to Michael Heseltine at the first cabinet meeting after the negotiations, he felt it necessary to show his colours. "I envy you," Mr. Heseltine muttered in his ear, "because you are part of history." Mr. Lamont replied, "It was part of history from which I would be willingly excluded." In the end, Mr. Lamont declined to sign the Maastricht Treaty at the formal ceremony. He sent his deputy, Francis Maude, instead. I am convinced that if Mrs. Thatcher had stayed on as leader, the Conservatives would not have won the election of 1992. For many people, this is not in any way a controversial comment. But where Mrs. Thatcher is involved, there is always likely to be another view. Many of those who pride themselves on being her friends and allies consider this is more than just a matter of opinion. It has become one of their core beliefs. In order to apportion the maximum blame on those who plotted against her and won, it is essential to be able to say that toppling her on electoral grounds was quite unnecessary. The 2 leaders who fought each other in the general election of that year, Mr. Major and Mr. Kinnock, are both convinced that Mrs. Thatcher would not have won. When I raised the point with Mr. Kinnock, he quickly dismissed the idea. He said Mr. Major was able to diffuse the row over the poll tax, which she would not have been able to do, and Mr. Major was above all able to present himself as the candidate for change. But the argument that Mrs. Thatcher could have won has at least one important advocate in the Labour Party, Tony Blair. In the summer of 2002, I asked, could she have won? And he replied, I am one of the few people who would say unhesitatingly, yes. Mr. Blair's view is that Labour had still not carried through its internal reforms in time. He said, come election time, everyone knows that it was a choice between this lot and that lot. He gestured towards 2 imaginary powers labelled Tory and Labour. And we weren't in shape. Although Neil Kinnock made absolutely heroic efforts to change the Labour Party, truthfully, we weren't sufficiently fundamentally changed. Mr. Major is among those who are not impressed by this argument, and he questions the motives of those who make it. Mr. Blair would understandably be anxious to stress the importance of the reforms he made in the run-up to Labour's victory in 1997. When the election was called in the spring of 1992, there was no general expectation that Mr. Major would make it back to Downing Street. The economy was mired in recession. Interest rates were just over 10%. John Smith looked and spoke like a chancellor in waiting. Paddy Ashdown was reckoned to be the most impressive of the three leaders, and there appeared to be a good chance of a Lib-Lab pact if the vote was not decisive. For Mr. Major, this was the most critical moment of his political career. Would he be able to win the election and therefore claim that he was the rightful occupant of number 10? Or would he be little more than a postscript at the end of the Thatcher era? The day he made the announcement, he sent a spray of 24 pink roses to Mrs. Thatcher's office, with a note attached telling her the election would be on April the 9th. Mr. Major knew that the way she behaved could decide whether he returned to number 10. Within a couple of days, Mrs. Thatcher was out campaigning to excited crowds in Southampton. Women shouted, "Come back, we love you." When asked to comment on the current Prime Minister, all she would say was, "The policies John Major is following are, I believe, the policies I created and put into practice." Mrs. Thatcher continued to have a problem in adapting to her new role. In the week that followed, there was a poignant occasion when she left the Commons for the last time. She walked alone into the chamber and made for the government front bench. Matthew Paris, the Times parliamentary sketch writer, was fortunate to be present. He wrote, "The table on which the dispatch box sits, where she had stood so many thousands of times, was littered with papers. Mrs. Thatcher walked up and tidied the mess. She put the documents together into neat little piles, glanced at her handiwork, and left. If only, she may well have thought, I could sort out Mr. Major and his ministers in the same way." About 50 journalists and cameramen followed her every move. It was about half the number she had attracted as Prime Minister, but it showed how important she still was to the media. There was considerable confusion about the part Mrs. Thatcher was meant to play. With the main parties so close in the opinion polls, her role was seen as crucial by some of those at Central Office. Other members of the Conservative team were determined that this should be Mr. Major's campaign. But the Thatcher loyalists prevailed when it was agreed that she should make a dramatic appearance at a campaign rally with Mr. Major. When the rally took place in Central Hall, Westminster, the problems of having Mrs. Thatcher play a prominent part immediately emerged. She, and not Mr. Major, was generally regarded as the star of the show. Norman Tebbit attempted to be helpful when he commented that no party worldwide could put such a talented duo on the platform, but he rather ruined the effect when he explained why he believed Mr. Major's performance had much improved of late. He said they've stopped putting sedatives in his tea. As the campaign progressed, there was a drip feed of critical comments from Mrs. Thatcher. The Sunday Times reported that she had told friends that the Tories did not have enough oomph, enough whiz, enough steam. It would have been easier for Central Office to play down the comment if it had not been so obviously true. There was, though, one clear blessing for Mr. Major. At least Europe was not an election issue. Labour had turned strongly pro-European and was reasonably united on their policy. The issues which were dominating the campaign were the usual ones: the economy, tax and spending, the public services, and the suitability of the main candidates for the top job. Labour had come a long way since the dismal internal battles in the 1980s. Peter Mandelson and others had worked skillfully to make the party a much improved electoral force. All the modern arts of presentation were employed. The red rose symbol was plucked from the dressing-up box of the French socialists, and sound bites were eagerly adopted. But Labour's campaign strategy had been based for so long on Mrs. Thatcher remaining in power, they found it difficult to switch their guns onto Mr. Major. Mr. Major mounted a successful counter-offensive. If Labour were going to be slick and show business, he would try to be simple and sincere. His proudest achievement was to reintroduce the soapbox for impromptu speeches at outdoor meetings. It could hardly have been less like the well-organised Thatcher campaigns of the past, and that was precisely the point. I was convinced that tax was the defining issue of the campaign, and said so in broadcasts before polling day. John Smith's shadow budget was launched on the assumption that people would be prepared to pay for improved services through increased taxes. The Tories estimated that the average family would be £1,250 worse off, and there was no member of the Westminster Press Corps who would benefit from Labour's tax plans. If political reporters had a personal axe to grind, it was obvious which party would suffer. The turning point in the campaign appeared to have been reached on April the 1st, with 8 days to go, when the polls put Labour up to 7 points ahead. The markets took it badly. The FD index plunged, and building societies warned of the threat of higher mortgage rates. That evening Labour held its disastrous rally at the Sheffield Arena. It was a spectacular media event with 10,000 spectators. But the more Labour looked confident of winning, the more the electorate took fright. I watched the coverage at home with a mixture of embarrassment and irritation. It annoyed people in many different ways. For some it was Mr. Kinnock acting as the MC, walking up and down, punching the air and shouting, "We're all right." It looked like a victory rally before any vote had been cast. Afterwards, the Labour leader, flushed with excitement, said, "The only time I've experienced anything like it was in Jamaica, where there was a crowd of 13,000, all high on ganja and rum." On this occasion, Mr. Kinnock appeared to be high on the prospect of power, and for millions of voters this was not a pleasing sight. I think the real problem for Mr. Kinnock was that it gave many voters an excuse not to vote Labour. The tax issue is not an easy one for opinion pollsters to get to grips with. It is not acceptable for many of us to say to a complete stranger that we want to keep our money and not have it spent on the public good. How much easier many people thought after the Sheffield rally simply to say, "I don't want that lot in government." Much to Mr. Major's credit, he had refused to become obviously downhearted when many of the opinion polls suggested he would lose, but the personal strain was enormous. His wife Norma packed their personal belongings into packing cases at number 10 in case they had to move the day after polling day. Election night was fraught for all the key figures. No one really knew what the outcome would be. At his home in Huntingdon, Mr. Major was convinced of victory when the Tories held on to one of their key swing seats, Basildon, but he then had to endure the sight of many old colleagues losing their seats, and the heavy blow when his chief lieutenant, the party chairman Chris Patten, lost his seat to the Liberal Democrats in Bath. In London, Lord McAlpine, the former Conservative Treasurer, held a party at his Westminster home attended by the Thatchers. The news came through soon after 1 a.m. that Mr. Patten had been defeated. A short distance away from the McAlpine party, at Central Office, there was a loud groan. Several of the staff burst into tears. But there was an astonishingly different response from the party attended by the Thatchers. Reporters heard an unmistakable cheer from the McAlpine home. Mr. Patten had become a bête noire for the Tory right. Pro-European, he had not been forgiven for telling Mrs. Thatcher he could no longer support her the night before she made her resignation announcement. Some of those present at the party confirmed that Mr. Patten's defeat had been cheered, but it seems that Mrs. Thatcher had not joined in. When Mr. Major came out of number 10 to celebrate, with both his hands held up high, it looked as if he had finally moved out of Mrs. Thatcher's shadow. It was a remarkable personal victory. But his triumph would be short-lived. Mrs. Thatcher's legacy had not yet passed into history. That cheer from her supporters against one of the chief architects of Mr. Major's victory would reverberate for a very long time. Many Tory supporters now look back and say there is only one thing which would have been better than winning the 1992 election, and that would have been if the Conservatives had lost. Any general election tends to be called a milestone. Sometimes it marks a new departure, but it can also be highly significant even if there is no change of government. The election of 1992 is the moment when some of the key Thatcherite reforms of the 1980s were consolidated. Had Neil Kinnock won, he would have made a determined attempt to roll back many of the changes, particularly those which curbed trade union power, reduced the size of the public sector, and cut back the influence of government. By the time Tony Blair came into office 5 years later, Mr. Kinnock's approach would be deemed old-fashioned. It would certainly not be New Labour. John Major wrote in his memoirs, "Our victory in 1992 killed socialism in Britain. It also made the world safe for Tony Blair. Our win meant that between 1992 and 1997, Labour had to change." But for Margaret Thatcher, the brutal way she had been removed from office was still uppermost in her mind. It could never be forgiven or forgotten, and she increasingly gave the impression she did not believe that Mr. Major had earned the right to be Prime Minister. Mrs. Thatcher's mood had not been enhanced during the election campaign. She was angry with Chris Patten for playing down the importance of Thatcherism as part of the Tories' electoral appeal. Instead, the Conservatives had concentrated on a negative campaign against Mr. Kinnock. Once the election was over, the Daily Mail quoted Mr. Patten's response. He said, "Mention any great advance of these years, the taming of the unions, the spread in home ownership and shares, the return of Britain to a senior world role, and that woman will get the credit." Mr. Patten's frustration was obvious. He was one of the many people who had contributed to Thatcherism, and he disapproved of the way she attracted so much of the limelight. Understandably, Mrs. Thatcher took a different view. 2 weeks after polling day, she let fly in an article for the American magazine Newsweek. The uncompromising headline was aimed directly at the Prime Minister. "Do not undo my work." She criticised the rise in public spending, the appointment of Michael Heseltine as Trade and Industry Secretary, and there was even a personal jibe at her successor. "There isn't such a thing as Majorism," she declared, ignoring the fact that Mr. Major had made no claim to an ism. "I don't accept the idea that all of a sudden Major is his own man," she said. "He has been Prime Minister for 17 months, and he inherited all these great achievements of the past 11.5 years. She was sharply critical of what was generally considered to be one of Mr. Major's strengths, his ability to reach consensus on difficult issues. She described consensus as the absence of principle and the presence of expediency. Even her loyal former press secretary, Sir Bernard Ingham, reacted badly to the article, complaining in the Daily Express of the way she had used such petulant terms. Sir Bernard concluded sharply that reticence becomes former Prime Ministers, not chattering to the chattering classes. But there is no doubt Mrs. Thatcher was expressing the thoughts of many of her loyal followers. They were annoyed at the way Mr. Major had bolstered his own position with appointments to his new cabinet. On Europe and other issues, it would reflect a more centre-left approach. Mr. Heseltine had chosen to revive the job title of President of the Board of Trade. His strong position in the cabinet pleased the pro-Europeans, as did the continuing presence of Mr. Hurd at the Foreign Office and the appointment of Kenneth Clarke as Home Secretary. There were, though, some concessions to the right of the party, with Peter Lilly installed at Social Security, Michael Howard at Environment, and Michael Portello, then seen as an ultra-loyal Thatcherite, joining the cabinet as Treasury Secretary. In the immediate aftermath of the election, not a great deal of attention was given to Mr. Major's small majority of just 21 in the House of Commons. Little, if anything, was made of the fact that if all the opposition parties united and 11 Tories decided to vote with them, that would be enough to defeat the government. Only later would it become clear that Mr. Major's small majority was one of the critical factors which undermined his premiership. There was little comment either about the outlook and political views of the new intake of Tory MPs. It was only when she had gone that Thatcher's children arrived in force on the green benches. Selection committees across the country had been faithfully reflecting the political views of her leadership. The old guard had given way to a less snobbish kind of Tory who would be more Eurosceptic and more ideological. Thatcher's children reflected the changes which had taken place within the Conservative Party since she became leader. Before then there were cliques and factions, but Tory MPs were far less likely to be divided on political grounds. The Labour Party, traditionally split between left and right, was a living example of the dangers of that approach. With constituencies decided on the basis of first past the post, it is crucial for differences to be settled internally before a party reaches out to the electorate. The Conservatives used to pride themselves on doing this. They would boast that, unlike the ideological Labour Party, they were able to change and adapt with the times. They did not take their politics too seriously. Mrs. Thatcher took her politics very seriously indeed. As she tried to put her stamp on the party and then take a grip on her government, she soon realised that this could not be done without a struggle. It was only in time that ambitious Tory MPs realised that they could only advance quickly if they could prove to Mrs. Thatcher that they were one of us. The ideological rift became known as the battle between the wets and the dries. The terms arose from one of Mrs. Thatcher's persistent remarks, used to dismiss those on the centre-left of the party whom she accused of being so wet. They in turn decided to adopt the label, using the term wet as a badge of honour. The Thatcherites became known as the Dries. By the time Mr. Major won the 1992 election, the relevant test was not so much being one of us or even dry. What those who made the selection wanted to know was a candidate's views on Europe. As Mr. Major prepared for the first session of Parliament after the general election, this change could hardly have been more significant. Europe was the issue from which he could not escape, and it was precisely the question on which he would find himself most at odds with members of his own party. The focus of attention was the Maastricht Treaty. Essentially, it set the European Union on a new course, which would lead to the adoption of the single currency by most of its members. There is no disguising the fact that other European leaders were keen to see the EU emerge with some kind of federal structure. This is not what either Labour or the Conservatives wanted. But what annoyed Mr. Major and his colleagues was that, in practice, they believed the changes would not be anything like as dramatic as the Eurosceptics or the Euro enthusiasts expected. When I spoke to Douglas Hurd in 2003, he pointed out that even though the Maastricht Treaty had been in force for many years, the Queen was still on the throne, and Tony Blair had been able to commit British forces to the invasion of Iraq, despite the opposition of France and Germany. For Mr. Major, there was a straightforward way of looking at the treaty. By introducing opt-out clauses covering the European Social Chapter and the single currency, he believed he had fully answered the concerns of those such as Mrs. Thatcher, who wanted Britain to stay out of any further moves towards European integration. He was particularly anxious, once these concessions had been made, that Britain should not be seen as the wrecker of the Maastricht Agreement. They had given their word, and it was now inconceivable for Parliament to turn round and reject the deal. It would make a mockery of Mr. Major's desire to be at the heart of Europe. The government decided to press ahead with the necessary legislation as soon as possible after the general election. With support from the Liberal Democrats, and with Labour now firmly pro-European, getting the bill through Parliament did not seem to present serious problems. There was even a slight hint that Mrs. Thatcher might decide to be more accommodating. In a speech in Holland, she complimented Mr. Major on his negotiating position at Maastricht. But the tone of the rest of her speech, a blistering attack on the powers of the European Commission, and yet another warning of the dangers of German dominance, gave heart to Conservative MPs preparing to defy the government. Her remarks were in sharp contrast with those made in the same week by the Queen, who for the first time addressed the European Parliament in Strasbourg. She had been prevented from doing so, as a matter of government policy, while Mrs. Thatcher was at number 10. On this occasion, with a large part of her speech in French, the Queen gave open support to Mr. Major's desire to appear more constructive in European affairs. When the first of the important votes on the Maastricht legislation came on May the 21st, at the end of a two-day debate, 22 Tory MPs went into the no lobby against the government, just one more than Mr. Major's overall majority. 3 times that number of Labour MPs voted against Maastricht, but it was the Tory rebellion which would prove far more significant. It was decided to move quickly on the bill, allowing the Tory rebels as little time as possible to build up their support. But just over a week later came the first of the hammer blows from abroad, which threatened to destabilise the government. In a close vote, Denmark rejected the Maastricht Treaty in a referendum. The Tory rebels were jubilant, believing that the treaty was now dead. Norman Tebbit declared, "It saves the EEC from a disaster." One of the Conservative MPs who had voted against the Maastricht Bill, Nicholas Winston, said, "I'm only sad that it is the Danes and not the British who are taking this decision. I think the British people would have turned it down flat if they had been given the opportunity." The Chancellor, Norman Lamont, who became openly far more Eurosceptic when he left office, heard the news as he was getting into his official car in Fleet Street. "I leapt into the air, punching it with my fist," he wrote in his memoirs. "I could not believe it. Could this, I wondered, be the end of the single currency?" When he phoned the Prime Minister early the next day, Mr. Major said, "I don't know whether to laugh or cry." Mr. Lamont told him it was quite clear what he should do, although the idea that Mr. Major would be able to laugh at a moment like this seems rather far-fetched. The Prime Minister was torn both ways. Letting the Maastricht Treaty fail would have rid him of a problem of internal party management, but it would also have destroyed his foreign policy. For the Tory Eurosceptics there was no such dilemma. They were convinced that at this point Mr. Major should have ruled out any attempt to revive the treaty. Unknown to Mr. Lamont, a decision had already been taken. As he was talking to Mr. Major, Douglas Hurd was making clear on the Radio 4 Today programme that attempts would be made to keep Maastricht alive and they would be backed by Britain. The Eurosceptics were furious. Within 24 hours of the Danish result, 70 Conservative MPs signed a motion calling for a fresh start on European policy. It was reported that 2 members of the Cabinet, Peter Lilly and Michael Portillo, had joined other Eurosceptic ministers in urging the Prime Minister to ditch the treaty. Many of the new Conservative MPs who had been persuaded to vote with the government only a fortnight before paraded their Eurosceptic views for the first time by signing the Fresh Start motion. Mrs. Thatcher let it be known that she thought the treaty should be abandoned. Denmark, she said, had done a great service for democracy against bureaucracy. In what looked like a sign of panic, ministers were forced to stop proceedings on the Maastricht Bill. Mr. Major repeated his commitment to the treaty and hoped the Danes would be able to join in due course. He ruled out the possibility of Britain holding a referendum on Maastricht. In this ungainly fashion, the battle lines were drawn between Mr. Major and a large section of his own party, which included a formidable former Prime Minister. It was less than 2 months after his remarkable election victory. Mrs. Thatcher prepared for the fight. She made clear she would like to take her seat in the House of Lords, so that along with other Eurosceptic new peers, she could play her part in trying to block the Maastricht Bill. After a referendum in Ireland in June had supported the treaty, the Prime Minister insisted there would be no retreat over Maastricht. If Britain broke its word, he declared, it would not be trusted again. He privately told colleagues he would resign if rebel Tory MPs defeated the bill. Baroness Thatcher, as she had become, within days repudiated her successor. Britain, she declared in a television interview, should forget Maastricht. Maastricht is a treaty too far. It takes so many powers from ours, the oldest parliament, which has been the example and inspiration to others. As if Mr. Major did not have troubles enough, the summer of 1992 brought serious economic problems. Britain was still caught in the tail end of a recession. Business longed for lower interest rates to stimulate demand, but that was not possible while the pound was still being held tightly within the ERM. If interest rates fell, the pound would have to fall. Mr. Major and Mr. Lamont argued that recovery would take time, people would have to be patient, but this advice carried less weight than usual because at the party Mr. Lamont had famously declared that the green shoots of economic spring are appearing once again. Doubts about the government's economic credibility were growing, but that was nothing compared with what was just around the corner. Mr. Major was about to become the unlucky Prime Minister. The government would be hit by a second hammer blow from abroad, and it would be much worse than the first one. End of Disc 4.